Our next speaker is Valur Ingimundarson, who is a professor here at the University of Iceland, and along with his colleagues is a very important player in EDA, the Center for Excellence at the university, and he is currently director. He's also an historian of contemporary history, and I've been very lucky to read some of his articles, all very interesting. So I'm delighted to have Valur with us, and of course he's one of the co-organizers of this event.
Thanks for this nice introduction, Cynthia. Just want to correct one thing. You know, I'm not the director of EDA, it's Irma Ellingsdóttir, but I'm the chair of the board. So what I'm going to talk about is the intervention in Kosovo and how it and its effects 10 years after, or what happened after the effect, and also in relationship with other interventions. The UN adoption of the responsibility to protect doctrine in 2005 was rooted in the 2001 report of the International Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty, commissioned by the Canadian government following the controversy of the legitimacy of the Kosovo War. The report stressed the need to reconcile the countervailing logics of sovereignty and human rights protection in response to mass atrocities. A year earlier, an independent international commission on Kosovo had made a similar case. While it found many faults with the NATO military intervention, it favored conditional independence for Kosovo. And in the Kosovo crisis in 1998-99, the UN Security Council had activated Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which can sanction military action in response to severe atrocities and other humanitarian emergencies that constitute a threat to peace and regional security. But it failed to agree on the authorization of military force due to Russian opposition. The responsibility to protect doctrine was meant to define the preconditions for interventions, advocating a greater reliance on non-military measures. Instead of stressing the right to intervene in other states, the problem was reframed by alluding to the responsibility to intervene and to protect the citizens of states that had demonstratively failed in its obligation to protect their own people. The UN Security Council backing of the Libyan intervention was rationalized and legitimized on these grounds. Yes, as was the case of Kosovo, the question of sovereignty, not the humanitarian dimension, soon became one of the main sources of criticism of the Libyan war, that it not only infringed on state sovereignty, but also encouraged or even propelled regime change. Thus, Russia and China and some other states saw the enforcement of the authorization through NATO's military action as violating the UN Security Council's mandate by aiding in the toppling of the Gaddafi regime. This position has raised the question about the viability of the responsibility to protect concept. In the Syrian crisis, Russia and China have repeatedly vetoed UN Security Council resolutions that would have imposed sanctions on the Syrian government and ruled out any sort of military intervention. Russia actually had earlier used the responsibility to protect doctrine to justify its own intervention in Southern Ossetia and Abkhazia in the 2008 Georgia-Russia war, but it has now reversed to the stance it adopted when opposing the Kosovo war, as it violated the sovereignty of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which at that time, after the cession of Slovenia, Bosnia, Croatia, and Macedonia, comprised Serbia and Montenegro. The controversy over the legitimacy and the terminology of international intervention after the Libyan conflict has furthermore led to calls by states such as Brazil to define in binding terms the responsibility to protect doctrine, to make sure that it will not be used for other purposes than protecting civilians. In other words, regime change should be explicitly excluded from it. Revisiting the Kosovo case, I will discuss here the tension between these concepts which figure prominently in the debate about this doctrine: human rights, sovereignty, and regime change. I argue that in many cases it's impossible to divorce the question of intervention from that of government and post-conflict sovereignty. The Kosovo experience is instructive in this regard. That not only be seen within the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. After being forcibly deprived of autonomy, the Kosovo Albanians, who constituted 90% of the population, had for a decade before the war fought the repressive Serbian regime, for self-determination and independence. This struggle alone would ensure that the sovereignty question would be at the center of any post-conflict settlement. I pay particular attention to two things here. First, I analyze the experience of institutionalizing international mandates, such as UN protectorates, to run contested territories on humanitarian grounds. Second, I point to the tension between the requirement that the responsibility to protect doctrine be limited to civilian protection on the one hand, and the risk of legitimizing and stabilizing political elites responsible for mass crimes in the name of sovereignty concerns on the other. I argue that it's doubtful that any normative and internationally sanctioned formula can be devised to authorize international action to stop mass atrocities, because geopolitical interests will always be central. The resurrection of protectorates and trusteeships, essentially controlled by Western states but legitimized by the United Nations and other international bodies, such as the EU, NATO, and the OSCE, was one of the starkest manifestations of the international system after the end of the Cold War. In contrast to the theory of sovereign equality underpinning the post-colonial international system, this idea was re-legitimized in the 1990s in response to state failures and humanitarian disasters. Having their origins in 19th century Western colonial rule and occupation regimes, these administrations in places like Kosovo, East Timor, or Bosnia constituted a new type of loosely structured political system depending on the cooperation of a range of military, political, administrative, and non-governmental organizations. Michael Booth and Thilo Moron acknowledge that protectorates and trusteeships are ideologically still linked to particular political and historical situations, traditional armed conflict, or to colonialism. And they point out that simply referring to such concepts may give rise to benevolent colonialism. But what they propose is to approach peacekeeping and peace building from this perspective of conflict management, and to stress the UN Security Council's task of maintaining international peace and security. In this way, it would be easier to allay concerns, as they put it, about the legality and limitations of UN operations and sidestep charges of neo-colonialism. Irrespective of the stabilizing intent of such a mission, a trusteeship entails the assumption of sovereignty over a given territory. The UN had such powers in Kosovo for almost a decade. Before Kosovo's declaration of independence in 2008, the UN Security Council Resolution 1244 was the UN's primary source of legitimization for its rule in Kosovo. It also served the purpose of keeping open Kosovo's future constitutional status until the great powers were prepared to address it. In the meantime, Kosovo remained nominally part of Serbia, even if it had no say in running it since the 1999 war, except for in the northern part, which is de facto divorced from the rest of Kosovo. During its post-war rule, the UN's open-ended mandate was justified and pursued by a single mechanism. The final status of Kosovo would not be addressed until a host of the externally imposed standards or democratic benchmarks had been achieved, including democratic institutions, rule of law, minority rights, and a functioning market economy. This was coupled with the UN's efforts to define Kosovo's political identity in terms of multi-ethnicity, which has to be seen within the context of the rationale for the humanitarian intervention, which underpinning the NATO's case for war. But the language and practice disciplining local political elites left much to be desired. It showed that international representatives were never able to shake off a quasi-colonial mentality when judging and rating their subjects. The institution building exercise was framed in rearing and learning terms. It started in the public space. The UN put up billboards all over Kosovo displaying a child under the heading, "Practice makes perfect." That these images infantilized Kosovars were not lost on the recipients, but largely ignored by the practitioners. Similarly, if politicians behaved in a satisfactory way, they were usually congratulated in a patronizing way by showing deepening maturity. And what accounted for the reluctance to confront the UN protectorate early on was not only war fatigue or complacency after the removal of a highly repressive regime. Since Western powers were seen as liberators, the Kosovo Albanians were reluctant to engage in actions that could offend them. In addition, they were dependent on the West politically and economically. But they never bought into the UN's policy of divorcing standards from status, or into the discourse on multi-ethnicity, Of course, they realized that without a commitment to minority rights, they would never receive full self-determination or to be integrated into supranational bodies, but they used collective memory as a tool to stress their claim to majority rule. This includes a memory of a total reorganization of political, social, and economic space in Kosovo during the 1990s, when the Albanians were first confronted with discrimination such as depopulation through forced emigration and later through ethnic cleansing and expulsion of hundreds and thousands. One should not belittle the geopolitical complications involving the Kosovo question, but the concentration of powers in one institution is impossible to reconcile with the principle of good governance, democracy, and the rule of law, even if it's justified as a temporary political arrangement. It also highlights the dilemma of peacekeeping and peace building in general, the tendency to move beyond initial political stabilization after a war to a highly ambitious state-building enterprise imposed from above. As in the case of most international administrations with such wide-ranging powers, the international administration lost credibility because it was seen as a guardian of an unworkable status quo. Universal and normative, if semantically loaded concepts such as humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect in international politics and law cannot be divorced from state interests. The Brazilian government has attempted to break the impasse between those states that insist on the inviolability of sovereignty and those that see the responsibility to protect as overriding sovereignty in exceptional circumstances. It is, however, unlikely that it will lead to a new code of conduct for interventions. As I have stressed here, the concept of interventions and sovereignty cannot in many cases be separated. To be sure, the Brazilian proposal stresses the limits of the legal, operational, and temporary elements of UN interventions, a case that would have spared Kosovo some of the uncertainty of the final status question. In addition, it demands from the international community a high level of responsibility for interventions cannot only have the detrimental effects on the state intervened, but also on neighboring states. Yet given its stance on sovereignty, the Brazilian approach can also have the perverse effect of rewarding governments responsible for mass atrocities. And given the record of the Milosevic regime in Kosovo, it was practically impossible to return Kosovo to Serbia as an autonomous territory as if the former Yugoslavia still existed. Thus, the insistence that regime change be excluded from the responsibility to protect doctrine may in many cases be unenforceable. Another relevant point in the debate is that the experience of civil wars in places such as El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras have revealed that authoritarian governments in control of the army are usually responsible for the vast majority of mass crimes committed. Interventions that assist those that resist repressive regimes do not necessarily have to be unjust or wrong. This is, of course, not to deny that intervention designed to topple governments can be justified in the name of humanitarianism, which is kind of a double standard there. And this, as another problem, but related one, applies to what Ulrich Beck and later Noam Chomsky dubbed military humanism, or the danger posed by the development of a new global military human rights system, which would erase the dividing line between war and peace. But after the Rwanda genocide, the international community will always be under pressure to intervene in some way. The question is just about the timing and the nature of the intervention in such cases. To sum up, external interventions pose a challenge to accepted norms pertaining to state sovereignty in an international system made up of nation states. The implementation of international human rights laws still ultimately lie with states. There are no real international enforcement rules that subordinate states to higher international authority. The question is how to forge a consensus on acting to prevent humanitarian disasters. Marta Finnmore and Catherine Seeking have argued that international norms go through a three-stage process, with each stage characterized by different actors and mechanisms. During the first one, norm emergence, a new idea is introduced into significant international policy discussions with the aim of persuading others to adopt and embrace it. In the case of the responsibility to protect doctrine, this role was played, among others, by the UN Secretary General and the Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty. The second stage of the norm cycle, norm cascade, can only occur when the first stage has reached a tipping point, after a number of crucial states have endorsed the norm. And the institutionalization of the norm is supposed to precede this stage. At the end of the cascade process lies the third and final stage, internationalization, in which a norm becomes an accepted rule of behavior. Judged by this rather too teleological process, the argument can be made that the responsibility to protect norm is stuck at the first stage, because it's still resisted by key actors. But as I have stressed here, the question is not only about the intervention itself, but also about what happens after it, during the so-called post-war period, whose temporal limits are as elusive as its political finality. In the case of Kosovo, the constitutional status of the intervening territory was kept in a limbo for 9 years before a solution was imposed. And the UN envoy responsible for the negotiations on Kosovo's final status, and actually to follow up on this discussion on gender, there was absolutely no women on the negotiation teams, either from the UN or the Albanian or Serbian side. It was totally male-dominated process from the beginning. But the UN envoy wanted the UN Security Council to sanction conditional independence, but due to Russian opposition, it proved impossible. And this led the Kosovo Albanians to proclaim independence unilaterally in accordance with a Western script. Yet the UN Resolution 1244 is still in force. Even if around 100 states have recognized Kosovo as an independent state, its meaning, however, has arguably changed. For most Western states, the main goal is not any longer to sanction a UN protectorate, a direct affront to the independence declaration, or to postpone the question on Kosovo status. Rather, it's to keep Serbia from acting on its territorial claim to its former territory. While it has resolutely contested Kosovo's independence, it is committed to Resolution 1244 and is prohibited from interfering directly in Kosovo's affairs on the premise that the territory is still under international supervision. Actually, the Serbian government, realizing that it would not get Kosovo back, had during the negotiations on the final status question wanted the territory to be under UN rule for another 20 years, making it a 30-year UN governing exercise. 5 years after its independence declaration, Kosovo is still very much dependent on external actors. The de facto partition of northern Kosovo always would pose a challenge to the Kosovo Albanians and guarantee Serbian government's involvement in Kosovo's affairs. To be sure, an internationally recognized identity with representation tied to a territory is far more likely to lead to a more stable identity than was the case before the 1999 intervention. Given the overwhelming majority of the Albanians in Kosovo, no matter how this will be presented and represented, this has the character of an Albanian entity. But 14 years after the military intervention and 22 years following the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, Kosovo is still a contested state, contested borders. But what this experience shows is that an open-ended international mandate without democratic local sanction, as has been mentioned here at this conference, or legitimacy in a way, because it always leads from stabilization to stagnation. It was exactly what happened there. It's not going to resolve the tension between self-determination based on majority rule and traditional state sovereignty claims. Thank you.
Once again, one sees that when you take a very specific case, it makes the more general dilemma deeper. So I'm happen to be a big believer in looking at the specific in order to be more appreciative of the problems at the level of the general. Yeah, that was Freudian.